Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this very timely webinar entitled Rule of Law in Times of Crisis, Combating Corruption's Economic Impact and Championing Human Rights in the Face of COVID-19. This webinar is organized by Strat-based ADR Institute in partnership with the Institute of Human Rights of the University of the Philippines Law Center. I am Jenny Domino, Strat-based non-resident fellow for democracy and human rights, and I will be moderating today's event. This webinar celebrates two important milestones this week: International Anti-Corruption Day, today, December 9, and International Human Rights Day, tomorrow, on December 10. Both anti-corruption and human rights initiatives are central to strengthening the rule of law and democracy, themselves crucial in national development, especially as we continue to live with the reality of the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has exposed the dangers of a fragmented response to an interlinked crisis. Corrosive capital, widespread human rights violations, and corruption are not separate issues that merit isolated responses. Instead, these exist in a shared cultural, political, and economic ecosystem. We have four wonderful speakers today: Judge Dolores Espanyol, Professor Elizabeth Aguilin Pangalangan, Mr. AJ Montesa, and Mr. Edwin Santiago. They will each elaborate on how a whole of society response at all levels can be done in the Philippines. There will be an open forum where you can ask questions to the speakers at the end of the panel presentations. In the meantime, please leave your questions and comments on the designated space on your Zoom screen. To formally open this event, I would like to turn it over to the president of Strat-based ADR Institute, Professor Dindo Manhit.
Thank you, Attorney Jen. Good afternoon to everyone and welcome to our virtual town hall discussion, Rule of Law in Times of Crisis, Combating Corruption's Economic Impact and Championing Human Rights in the Face of COVID-19. This is one of our core advocacies in the Institute and part of our democratic governance program. And it is also one of the key advocacies of a civil society organization that I helped establish nearly 7 years ago, or a little over 7 years ago, Democracy Watch, who is partnering with us, with Transparency International Philippines, to share views and thoughts on this topic. It reminds me of what I wrote in the Philippine Daily Inquirer on the week of the lockdown, March 17. I'm not into the health issue per se, but I've just felt like as we lock down, as we see government taking over control of Philippine society, I said we might forget the other virus, which is corruption. And this was published by the Philippine Daily Inquirer, if I remember, a Friday. It was a Friday, first Friday of the lockdown of the country, where I said the problem of corruption is complex and multidimensional, requiring the collaboration of both the public and private sectors. The government and the private sector must work together to promote greater transparency and accountability in governance and build institutional integrity. Here in Stratbase, one of the areas that we continue to monitor is the effects of COVID in the whole of Philippine society. Part of the Stratbase group, we have a team that we call the Stratbase Research and Intelligence. And one of the areas that they've been tracking is the issue as one of the risks during this COVID is what we call COVID-19 corruption. A key risk to Philippine democracy, a key risk to the national election of 2022 if we allow it to perpetuate not only in Philippine society, in Philippine government, but perpetuate in our lives. I even shared these views in our last Filipinas conference 2 weeks back, whereby I've said as government moves to ramp up COVID-19 responses, and we see increase in funding alongside even the impact of past 2 typhoons. The current level of transparency and accountability leaves much to be desired. I personally believe that the presence of a health crisis, of this continuing health crisis, even a crisis due to disasters, has always been used as the buffer in committing democratic shortcuts. It's about releasing urgent allocation of public funds, and we forget about important oversight mechanisms. In a myopic point of view, I consider this as corrosive. It has a corrosive effect on such democratic practices or undemocratic practices, assails the very foundation of what good and responsive governance should be or ought to be. And when you see numbers like this is just one area of what government has spent in COVID. And this is as of June 30. We're still waiting for the next report of government. I could have included other studies whereby government has contracted loans after loans and released to different government agencies just to address COVID. It creates certain fear on my part. I spent 26 years as a professor of governance in the De La Salle University, studied about it in graduate school, but still, more than 3 decades of trying to advocate for transparent and accountable governance, it makes me feel that still there's something still wanting. And we continue to advocate that in our institute. You see this number being proposed that might be approved this week or the latest next week. 4.5 trillion. Again, increased by 9.9%. And some even would say there should be more just to address the challenges of COVID. I agree with the need for some interventions, but you just hope that there are enough safeguards to make officials accountable, to make the system transparent. I came across this article from Transparency International just over the weekend, and I wanted to share this as if it was written for us in this virtual town hall discussion. It's called Political Integrity, published over the weekend by Transparency International, whereby undisclosed, unchecked, or undue influence over the powerful skews resources and policies away from the common good. It perpetuates inequality, undermines democracy, and deprives people of their human rights. Building political integrity requires context-specific, comprehensive systems that combines measures to prevent political corruption. And that's what I believe we need. Then you come across this joint statement between Transparency International, Civicus, and Amnesty International that government must provide reasoned justification for the choices they make, both to contain the pandemic and to boost their economies. A public health emergency should not be taken as an opportunity to bypass accountability. And we see or hear even our own president being very defensive about it in his last address just 2 days back. So we call on all governments and other actors involved to ensure that all responses to the COVID-19 outbreak are in compliance with international human rights law and standards, taking into account the specific needs of marginalized groups and people, and those most at risk, and that the specific human rights risks associated with any particular response are addressed and mitigated. It's so appropriate to something that we track in this institute, COVID-19 corruption. And even this emerging risk that we are doing a research on. So I've invited the point person of our research, Professor Edwin Santiago, to expand this further later as one of our speakers. We call it corrosive capital. When you have investments, projects in the form of ODA, driven either by state partnership with the Philippine government through ODA or private capital coming from authoritarian nations that lack accountability and transparency. We believe that it's especially dangerous for weakened democracies as it erodes the strength of the rule of law and enables corrupt practices. My colleague Edwin will speak more about this, but I wanted to flag this also because we are devoting efforts in the Institute to raise awareness on this corrosive capital that we need even to look at investments in our country, not only for private, but even state-sponsored investments like official development funds. Allow me to cite our moderator. I don't know if Attorney Jen remembers this. She wrote about this last year. Uh, and I wanted to quote her that the Philippines has much to celebrate in terms of drawing up a framework and putting systems in place to ensure human rights protection and accountability. However, reality presents a grimmer picture. The past years have shown us how these systems can easily be manipulated to violate instead of protecting our rights. The most sophisticated legal devices cannot stop state abuses, but only the Filipino people can. As if Attorney Jen, our moderator, was writing it this week, given that the need, that it's about the whole of society. It's about us not waiting for government to stop these abuses or not even looking for political leaders. In what I quoted earlier about integrity, public integrity, I took note of this line, holding the powerful to account for the common good. And I want to leave that line as a thought in our afternoon virtual town hall discussion. But as we need responsive governance founded on the principles of transparency and accountability to surmount these continuing health and economic challenges. We need the whole of society to work together as a stepping stone towards good and responsive recovery and growth from this induced crisis. And we need various sectors of civil society. I'm hoping, as the president of this institute, as we gather this afternoon, we discuss, we share ideas, this could simply be a first step of a common goal to advocate this, to put pressure if needed, and to hold the powerful to account for the common good. Again, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in this virtual town hall discussion.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks, Professor Dindo, and for graciously citing my piece. Our first speaker will talk about the significant role of civil society in fighting corruption and human rights abuses in the face of COVID-19. No better person can speak about this than Judge Dolores Espanyol, a founder and current chairperson of Transparency International Philippines, a non governmental organization that aims to fight corruption by empowering civil society driven anti corruption initiatives. She has also served as a regional trial court judge. Judge Espanyol obtained her law degree from the University of the Philippines and her master's in economics from Lyceum of the Philippines. Among other credentials, she has pursued a CEDA scholarship on economic development at Lakehead University in Ontario, Canada, and a special course on U.S. constitutional law and international law at the American Academy in Dallas, Texas. Judge Espanyol, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, fellow speakers, organizers, officers, and members of Strat-based ADRi Institute, ladies and gentlemen. Corruption is sin. It is now in pandemic-like magnitude. It is comparable to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is a virus that has magnified the incidence of corruption due to the abundance of social amelioration funds as dole-outs. This situation has opened opportunities to make hay while the sun is up, or since to strike hard when the iron is hot. That beckons the opportunist to a more aggressive operations, as to them it may be the last chance to amass wealth. This is the big picture, but let me dissect the anatomy of this social disorder that has evaded so many national leaders to carve the dust, allowing it to grow into a menace of the nation. Corruption is the stashing of public funds for private gain. Thus the public funds intended for economic development to improve the social imbalance in our society. The poor becomes poorer, resulting in the ever-increasing incidence of sufferings of the people, coupled with disasters that visit our country, reportedly more than 20 times or 20 typhoons a year, flooding and waterborne diseases. This situation results in the increase of taxes being imposed by the government mostly, and adversely affecting the middle income people in the workforce, further exacerbating the sufferings of the people composed of 23 million families. And to augment the revenue collection of the government, we resort to foreign borrowing. Right now, it is reported that our foreign loans have already reached 3.22 trillion pesos in 10 months from January to October, only or 233% increase compared to the national government borrowing from 2016 to 2019 of 3.32 trillion pesos in 4 years. This has risen to 51.2% debt to gross domestic product of the country in less than a year, more particularly in 10 months only. This will result in more serious economic strangulation, with Filipino industries being swallowed by foreign capitalists and Filipino workers as mere hewers of wood, a very dangerous tendency, as top government officials have gleefully announced that Philippines raises $2.75 billion from global bonds. To top it all, it is reported that our foreign debt has risen to 10 trillion pesos, which is a little over than the annual budget that we have, which is supposed to be approved in the amount of 4.5 trillion pesos. Moreover, with these financial constraints due to corruption, we face first, the existence of incongruent policy formulation and adoption, and second, the actual stashing of public funds have been used for economic development, result in a wide range of deprivation affecting the Filipino people. The constitutional mandate that requires the highest priority to protect and enhance the right of all the people to human dignity, reduce social, economic, and political inequalities, have been stolen from the general public by corrupt government officers and men. While the executive and the legislative branches of our government have immediately responded to the COVID-19 crisis by adopting the SAP 1 and 2 laws, and a third SAP 3 is still in process. The legislative bodies, however, have in the implementation generated many more aberrations that several sectors of the intended beneficiaries have to this day not been able to receive the financial assistance intended for them. As a result, There were so many reported anomalies related to the distribution by the LGUs that recently have stopped reporting the incidents of corruption. But in our legal system, these corruption cases should not stop by merely exposing them. The rule of law has to start grinding its wheels once the cases are filed before the courts of law. For a myriad of reasons, it seems that cases have not reached the courts, yet the corruption virus continues to creep and gnaw the spirit and soul of the country. However, even if the corruption cases reach the courts, resolving them takes at least 4 or 5 years in the trial courts and another 4 or more years in the appellate courts, and hopefully less than 5 years in the court of last recourse, which is the Supreme Court. Delays are resorted to in order to wait for a favorable election atmosphere in the public, so the public official can win in the election and wield more power in manipulating the outcome of the criminal cases. Likewise, when cases are stalled in the courts, the accused continue with enterprise in order to source out funds to sustain their lifestyle and to finance his case and election, especially if some of the pillars of the criminal justice system have also been infected with the corruption virus. Some of the pillar members have resorted to holding on to cases as it has become an extra income generating machine for them, where every move or action has a price tag depending on the seriousness of the case. The 5 pillars of the criminal justice system are: 1, law enforcement; 2, prosecution; 3, courts and law practitioners; 4, penology institutions; and 5, community and media. Corruption exists in so many forms and multifaceted in its consequences. In short, it is a conglomeration of aberration of character, or simply put, it is unrighteousness, the opposite of righteousness. As it is warped, depraved character, the state has adopted the revised penal code some 85 years ago and a multifarious legislation to punish the criminals while the victims of criminal acts and their families endlessly suffer in agony, expecting justice to be for their beloved once that are scarcely being enjoyed by them. Some people have the notion that violation of human rights is only political in nature, such as red tagging, political persecution or prosecution, political vendetta, or sowing fear or fomenting terror as defined under the anti-terrorism law. Although 37 petitions now are pending before the Supreme Court, praying that it be declared unconstitutional is part and parcel of democratic and Republican form of government. Moreover, as one of the requirements for a candidate to be disqualified from running in an elective position is the finality of the resolution of the case. So even when a chain of criminal cases are filed against the prospective elective officials, they nevertheless run for office using it as a shield to public recriminations, and very often, once in power, they get exculpated or the prosecution is halted or as the cases are dismissed for lack of evidence. Another form of corruption is economic deprivation. This is worse than the regular criminal act of corruption, such as malversation of public funds, plunder, diversion of funds from public use, such as projects are not completed, as funds have been used for other purposes, or the project funding is overvalued, but the quality is substandard. Plunder or malversation involving public funds result in the deprivation of a bigger sector of society who depend on the government for job opportunities, a fair and just compensation, and ease and affordable fares and comfort in using public transportation. Decent and safe shelter over their heads, and accessible, affordable health facilities and medicines, and free and reasonable educational institutions. To some, these social responsibilities of the government have become benign or extinct in some cases. The creation of so many fact-finding bodies to investigate, identify, and initiate criminal actions against corrupt public officials and civil servants are irrelevant for the following reasons. One, the wheels of justice grind so slowly that in its place corruption thrives even more, as the pillars of the criminal justice system are no longer what pillars connote. Two, threats, intimidation, summary killings, incarceration, or death punishment to be restored merely create more forms of corruption. Three, political agenda supervening a just and fair democratic society that exists merely in name. Four, a lack of strategic and systematic planning of government programs germane to the solution of the problem. Five, appointment of government officials based on integrity and educational preparation of the policy and function of the agency to be filled up. Six, absence of insightful educational drive to capacitate people concerned before program implementation so that it will not be a hit or miss solution to the problem on hand. Seven, absence of an independent body to review the duties and responsibilities of civil servants to incentivize them. Eight, passive and selective implementation or enforcement of laws. Nine, lack of actual monitoring and evaluation. Systems in the performance of government agencies or entities by a political stakeholder or non-governmental organization. 10, capacitate the civil servants with the attitude of being proactive instead of merely reactionary. 11, establish the policy that will promote transparency and accountability among the civil servants. 12, make industry, integrity, and probity as basis of promotions in public service. And 13, instill the principle that the public office is a public trust and the public officer is duty bound to serve the public and not their private interests. The flurry of palliative solutions merely show that we are making use of the cut and paste or trial and error technology that is only applicable in the absence of human beings as objects of reforms. Likewise, it is important that in the thrust to fight corruption should not be focused on prosecution and incarceration. It must be prevention so as to safeguard public funds aside from eroding the character of the civil servants. Recent reports estimate the loss due to corruption amounting to over 700 billion pesos a year. And amount can and this amount can be used to build public schools, evacuation centers, hospital facilities, decent housing facilities to eliminate squatting among the other along the waterways and prevent flooding risk and polluting waters in the system. Why do we have all these calamities, crises, disasters, risks to lives and limbs now prevailing not only in our country but globally as well? These are ways by which God is dealing with us due to our sins. And as corruption is seen, we are not only disgraced, we are menaced as a people because of unrighteousness. We tend to believe that we are blessed with the democratic institutions existing in our midst, but we are in dire want of enjoying the beneficial elements as we are in serious fear and or anxious of what is happening around us. The recent killings of judges, lawyers, journalists, and those who traverse the path of some hardcore politicians so fear and trembling that they might be the next to disappear and be included in the role of missing persons. Dissent is guaranteed. This dissent is guaranteed in a democratic form of government, but conversely, it is also guaranteed to those who exercise police powers. So where is the balance? Where is democracy? Is it a misnomer? Is it real or imaginary? In Article 2, Democratic Declaration of Principles and State Policies, our country is a democratic and republican state. In Section 1, sovereignty resides in the people and all government authority emanates from them. Under this principle, sovereignty implies the supreme authority to govern, and as such, the Filipino people have the right to constitute their own government, to change it, and to define its jurisdiction and powers, exercised directly through suffrage. With these powers, the people have the right to revolt. However, there are attempts to clip this right of the people, even as what the people are exercising is the right to dissent against the abuse of power, excessive constraints in the guise of police power, in combating organized activism, as the complaints and miseries of the underprivileged and downtrodden sectors of our society are unattended to over a long period of time. We need to stop counting the excesses of authorities in power, and in its stead, let us start rebuilding society. You will agree with me that Filipinos are more endowed with talents compared to other nationals worldwide. In one instance, a top officer of the US State Department admitted to me that the US payroll system made through the state designated banks was introduced by a Filipino military officer who was on scholarship training program in the US. We have intellectual superiority among other government officials in other countries. And why are the Filipino health workers being preferred over other nationals? The household workers, seafarers, engineers, and many others are the envy of other workers of other nations. It is due to the exceptional qualities of Filipinos that we should harness and employ to the optimum level. However, due to the existing imbalance in our needs, a bigger number of our dedicated workers prefer to migrate to other countries for better opportunities. Further, some sectors of our population believe that the government is repressive in its efforts to address dissenting or resenting sectors. The most recent example of which is the passage of the Anti-Terrorism Act. The flurry of petitions now pending before the Supreme Court pleading the highest tribunal to declare it unconstitutional is an exercise of democratic practices under a rule of law. I therefore pray and hope that the struggle will not result in armed conflict. It is sad to note that a young dissenter was killed because of her belief that she has the right to seek redress under the constitutional ambit. Yet, there are some government officers who make public conclusion that as the party list member of Congress is the mother of the daughter who was allegedly affiliated with a terrorist group, then she, the congresswoman, is also a member of some terrorist group. This pronouncement appears to be misplaced, as if descent is hereditary or a gene that can run in the family and be transferred by birth to other members of the family. I honestly believe that every well-meaning member of society has to make a stand in order to promote the essence of the biblical teaching. For a minute, please. Biblical teaching in Matthew 26:52. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." Rather, believe in the stark consequences of sin and wickedness in the following biblical passages, giving instruction to Moses in Exodus 32:34. "But go now, lead the people where I told you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I will punish them for their sin." In Proverbs 11:21, "Assuredly, the evil man will not go unpunished, but the descendants of the righteous will be delivered." And in Isaiah 13:11, "Thus I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will also put an end to the arrogance of the proud and abase the haughtiness of the ruthless." Tyrants and despots included in the side notes. Thus, with the profuse biblical warnings above, it is fitting to quote another admonition in Psalm 7:11-16. "God is a righteous judge and a God who has indignation every day. If a man does not repent, he will sharpen his sword. He has bent his bow and made it ready. He has also prepared for himself deadly weapons. He makes his arrows fiery shafts. Behold, he travails with wickedness, and he convenes mischief. He conceives mischiefs and brings forth falsehood. He has dug a pit and hollowed it out, and has fallen into the hole which he made. His mischief will return upon his own head, and his violence will descend upon his own fate." With the above teachings, if we can practice them, we may be able to enjoy the blessings of another biblical assurance in Proverbs 14:34, "Righteousness exalt a nation, but sin is a disgrace to any people." In conclusion, I may add that as corruption is in a pandemic situation engulfing our country, that corruption is seen, and it does not only bring disgrace to any people, it is first and foremost, a menace to our nation. Thank you, and may the Lord Almighty bless us all and free us from the shackles of corruption, including illegal drug trading and addiction, which is the worst form of corruption as it affects the entire population. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for taking your time.
Not a problem at all, Judge Espanol. Thank you very much for sharing the excellent insights. You vividly underscored the link between corruption and human rights violations and the need for congruent anti corruption policy, robust prosecution of corruption cases, but most importantly, effective preventive measures. Our next speaker is Professor Elizabeth Aguilin Pangalangan, a tireless human rights advocate, and I'm happy to be able to say my former boss at the UP Institute of Human Rights when I was a law student many years ago. Professor Pangalangan is a full professor at the University of the Philippines College of Law and director of the UP Institute of Human Rights. She obtained her bachelor's in law degrees from the University of the Philippines Diliman and earned her Master of Laws degree from Harvard Law School, where she served as a visiting scholar and later as a research fellow at Harvard's East Asian Legal Studies program. She was a fellow of the International Leadership Program at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and enjoyed a scholarship to the Hague Academy of International Law summer program. Professor Pangalangan served the university as executive director of the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies from 2007 to 2009. Abroad, she has lectured at the Leiden University Law School's Advanced Masterclass in Human Rights and the Summer School on Children's Rights in 2019. She was also part of the faculty panel of the Masterclass for Migration at the University of Antwerp. She continues to represent the Philippines as an expert in the study and crafting of conventions with the Permanent Bureau of the Hague Conference on Private International Law. She has written extensively on family law, conflict of laws, and human rights, and has been published in Central Professional Books, Routledge, Kluwer Law International, and Cambridge University Press. Professor Pangalangan will talk about how corruption and human rights violations undermine democratic institutions. Over to you, Professor.
Good morning. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for the generous introduction, Jen. Ladies and gentlemen, I first would like to thank Professor Dindo Manhit, President of StratBase, ADRi, for this invitation to speak, and for the Institute of Human Rights of the University of the Philippines College of Law to partner in this consequential and relevant forum as we commemorate the International Anti-Corruption Day today and tomorrow, the International Human Rights Day. The theme of the 2020 Anti-Corruption Day is United Against Corruption, which focuses on corruption as a major hindrance to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 SDGs, and among these are ending poverty, ending hunger, ensuring healthy lives, ensuring inclusive quality education, achieving gender equality, and reducing inequalities within and among countries. This year's Human Rights Day theme centers on building back better by ensuring that human rights standards are applied in all recovery efforts and in addressing the systemic discrimination laid bare by COVID-19 pandemic. From these themes alone, we are made aware that good governance and human rights are mutually reinforcing. We see their interplay in that good governance is an essential precondition to promotion and protection of human rights, and that human rights is the foundation for good governance. Governance is defined by the UN High Commission on Human Rights as, and I quote, the process whereby public institutions conduct public affairs, manage public resources, and guarantee the realization of human rights. Good governance accomplishes this in a manner essentially free of abuse and corruption, and with due regard for the rule of law. The UN High Commission for Human Rights further adds that, and I quote again, the true test of good governance is the degree to which it delivers on the promise of human rights, end of quote. Hence, A government that promotes accountability, equality, and transparency is able to secure the economic and social well being of its citizens and provide an environment conducive to the full enjoyment of all human rights. On the other hand, abuse or corruption in government promotes inequality and violates international human rights standards. Poor governance, such as inefficiency in delivering basic services, results in depriving people of their rights. Corruption undermines the government's ability to deliver health services to the public and violates the right to health. Corrupt practices divert funding aimed at social services. Hence, we see that traditionally the central consequences of corruption at the highest level of government were viewed as an issue of economic and social rights. Government programs in education and public health, including maternal care, and public works were also being lost to depredation. For example, the Department of Health is being questioned on the procurement of allegedly overpriced medical supplies, including PPEs and swabbing system used in the PCR test. Republic Act 11469, or the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act, was passed in March 25, 2020 as a response to COVID-19. It has exempted crisis-related procurement activities from the rigors of procurement law and application of competitive public bidding procedures. This exemption allows the government to override accountability with regard to the price of the products, amount of disbursement, and quality of the products procured. Moreover, the lack of transparency shields them from scrutiny of the press and jurisdiction of the judiciary. Another example is the recent corruption scandal in PhilHealth, a government-owned and controlled corporation tasked with the implementation of the country's universal healthcare law. The alleged PhilHealth corruption has taken many forms: diverted premium payments, overpriced equipment, fraud cases against employees, fraudulent claims of ghost patients for dialysis, non-COVID-19 health facilities receiving large funding and advance payment, and anomalous monetary claims by healthcare institutes who are not eligible in the first place. The mismanagement of supplies and resources impedes their flow to those who are truly in need. Thus, corruption in field health equates to violation of the right of Filipinos to health and to life. A third example is in the distribution of cash aid under the Social Amelioration Program for poor families affected by the pandemic. The corruption in the implementation of the SAP was so rampant that hundreds of local officials, government employees, and civilian accomplices were subjected to investigation for the anomalous distribution of the cash aid. This abuse has resulted to negative economic impact primarily felt by the poor. For example, ineligible families received assistance under SAP and took slots reserved to those who were severely affected by the pandemic. Others resorted to falsifying documents in order to manipulate the list of beneficiaries, which increases inequalities amongst Filipino families. Aside from this, some health workers deployed by the Department of Health to local government units have not received benefits and salaries. 5 DOH officials were suspended over the supposed delay in releasing benefits to health workers during the pandemic. The Office of the Ombudsman will look or has started looking into the delay in the release and processing of benefits and financial assistance of medical frontliners who were infected by the virus. The corruption in distributing SAP cash aid and delay in releasing benefits to health workers both amount to violation of the right to property. The second part of my presentation will focus on civil and political rights. As we see, the breach of economic rights resulting from corruption remains in plain sight, as I've already given examples of this. But there has emerged an entirely new dimension, namely that corruption begets violations of civil and political rights as well. First, information blackout, misinformation, and lack of free press have helped pave the path for the spread of coronavirus and the negatively affected other governments' response to the pandemic. If we recall, recall, the first case of COVID-19 can be traced back to November 17, 2020, weeks before authorities announced the emergence of the novel virus and months before other countries acted on the pandemic. The Chinese government is widely criticized over attempts to cover up the outbreak. Dr. Li, a Chinese ophthalmologist, posted his chat room warning about a disease that he said was like SARS as far back as December 30, 2019, almost a year ago. In early January, the authorities in China reprimanded him and forced him to sign a statement denouncing his warning. In February of this year, Dr. Li died of the virus he warned against. The government of China enforced early censorship to suppress information about COVID 19 and the dangers it posed to public health. The curtailment of the freedom of expression did not only cause the belated discovery of the virus, but also adversely affected the response of different countries and organizations in combating the pandemic. Chinese officials provided information to the WHO on 3 January 2020, and the first public confirmation that the disease could be transmitted by humans came only on 21 January. During a pandemic, the human right to access information is crucial. Without sufficient, reliable information on the nature of the virus and forecast of the pandemic's trajectory, the public was left clueless in navigating the myriad of health concerns. Likewise, the right to freedom of expression and freedom of the press are vital in addressing the COVID-19 and in disseminating information regarding its deleterious effects. In the Philippines, these very same rights have been limited through laws proposed to counter disinformation or fake news. As earlier stated, the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act criminalizes people who make and spread false information. So the goal of Republic Act 11469 is good. We shouldn't be spreading false information, fake news, at a time when people are at the edges of their seats. So there is good in that. However, several groups expressed their concern, arguing that the fake news provision threatens freedom of expression and of the press. Several were nabbed for the alleged violations of the provisions, including a Cebuano film writer who posted on Facebook about COVID contamination in Sitio Zapatera, Cebu City. Corruption affecting violations of traditional civil and political rights is exemplified further by government officials as well as their families and domestic help and staff who were asymptomatic yet got repeatedly tested despite a DOH policy that COVID tests should only be administered to the elderly and the symptomatic patients. Given that at that time, sometime in March this year, there were only 2,000 COVID-19 testing kits in the entire Philippines. To make matters worse, these public officials received quick results on their tests, while actual PUIs or persons under investigation, including medical frontliners, were dying before their test results came out. This illustrates that corruption promotes inequality by discriminating against those without the wherewithal, the ordinary men and women in the street, in accessing public health services. These not only violate the economic and social rights to health and to social services, but violate as well the human rights principles of equality and non-discrimination. Or we can think of this as a violation of civil and political rights of freedom from discrimination and the right of equal protection before the law. In conclusion, let me say that corruption undermines the rule of law and results in mistrust in government entities. Without public trust, people are discouraged from exercising their rights, feeling that they are powerless, they have nothing to contribute, there is nothing they can do to change things. They are discouraged from claiming and demanding that these rights be respected, protected, and fulfilled by the state, a duty that the state has by signing the different human rights treaties. Human rights provide the content, norms, and standards of good governance. Human rights principles form the backbone of good governance efforts, and lays out standards in developing legislative frameworks, policies, and programs, as well as provide for accountability standards. Government institutions that are sensitive to human rights encourage legislative reforms that help institutions to be effective. Finally, democratic reforms in government create opportunities for citizens to involve themselves in policy making through consultation and formal processes. It is when citizens are involved that they are able to express their opinions and make the right informed decisions, both in terms of life choices, both in their private lives as well in their public lives, and in the choice of their leaders. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that illuminating and comprehensive discussion, Professor Pangalangan, and highlighting the interplay between good governance and human rights. Our next speaker, Mr. AJ Montesa, will talk about the economic impact of corruption. Mr. Montesa is an economist affiliated with Action for Economic Reforms, an independent, reform oriented activist policy group that envisions a dynamic national economy and a socially oriented market economy. He obtained a Bachelor of Sciences degree in economics at the University of the Philippines. Mr. Montesa, over to you.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, Attorney Domino, and thank you to ADR Stratbase also for inviting ADR to participate in this webinar. Fortunately, the bright legal minds who were speakers before me already gave a comprehensive presentation on corruption and how it affects the strength of our institutions. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is I'm going to talk about how we can incorporate um, anti-corruption or the concept of rule of law into our economic model of development. So I'm not a legal expert by profession, but rather I'm an economist, and that's what I'll try to introduce into this discussion this afternoon. So, to begin with, not only are we celebrating the International Day of Human Rights and Anti-Corruption, um, but in 3 weeks' time, we'll also be commemorating the death of Dr. Jose Rizal. And I think I want to share this passage as a preface to my presentation. In it, he describes how over a century ago, the Filipinos back then had to face the same
Um, M-
issues of,
Mr. Montesa, uh,
yes,
your your voice is really soft. We can't hear you well. Maybe there's something wrong with the mic.
okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, but it's really soft.
Okay. I'll try to, sorry, I'll try to change my sound settings. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, this is better. Perfect.
Okay, all right. Okay. Sorry for that difficulty. So again, Dr. Jose Rizal here was talking about the daily struggles that Filipinos had to deal with. Um, could from things as simple as applying for government permits, for example. He describes one must count on the goodwill of government officials, on the influence of this one, on a good bribe to another in order that the application not be pigeonholed. And he talks about how Filipinos must have had great patience, great knowledge of how to get along, plenty of money, and a great deal of politics, many salutations, great influence, plenty of presence, and complete resignation. So I think this is something that we can still relate to uh, even over a century later. So for today, I'm going to be structuring my presentation in three parts. We're going to incorporate the notion of institutions into our model of economic development. Second, we're going to look at the data, some empirical observations on where the Philippines is as regards to the rest of the world. And finally, I'm going to talk about a pragmatic approach and how this applies to COVID-19. So in a seminal paper by Darren Asimoglu in 2001, he talked about how institutions are sort of a remnant of our colonial experience. So again, this is why even today, Dr. Jose Rizal can still be relevant. In this paper, he talked about, for example, the difference between colonial settlements in, for example, in South America versus in North America, and how the difference in those colonial institutions uh, set up the kind of democratic institutions that would persist up to the present. This led to Darren Asimoglu and James Robinson to author the book Why Nations Fail, and I encourage you to read this book. It's a very good overview of how institutions affect economic development. And in here they argue that there are two kinds of institutions: inclusive economic institutions and extractive economic institutions. So inclusive economic institutions are those that enforce property rights, they create a level playing field, and they encourage investments in new technologies. And altogether, these are very conducive towards growth. In contrast, extractive economic institutions are structured to extract resources from the many to the few. So, for example, way back then during the colonial period, um, in South America, the Spanish conquistadors set up more extractive institutions. Basically, they just wanted to mine as much gold as possible to bring back home. So they did not have regard for property rights, for example. They did not set up proper settlements. In contrast, in North America, because there was not as much gold, or there was scarcely any gold, the settlers, the early settlements in Jamestown, for example, had to set up more democratic institutions to give incentives to the settlers to be more enterprising or to invest more in the local economy. So, broadly speaking, also, we have a lot of literature on what institutions are. So, we're not just talking about the constitution, for example, or the set of laws in the country. Broadly speaking, institutions include the formal rules, such as the constitution and laws, as well as regulations and all of these things. But they also include the informal constraints, such as conventions, norms, tradition, religion, for example, and even self enforced codes of conduct, the unspoken rules of society. um, and altogether, these form what we call the rules of the game, and we are all players in this game. So you can think of formal versus informal institutions as the concept of de jure versus de facto, right? You have what is on paper versus what you have in actuality in real life. And the thing about institutions is they dictate our incentives. They dictate what roles we play in society. They dictate what strategies we take in society. So the approach that we're taking is not to look at just the individual, but rather the institutions and incentives that they are working with. The World Bank also recognizes the importance of institutions, governance consisting of traditions and institutions by which authority is exercised in a country. So, all of this together, of course, they are baked into our model of economic development. So, in general, we know this. We know that stronger governance and better institutions actually help the environment for investment. They reduce risk and increase profitability. And investors, of course, they are likely to prefer making long-term investments when they feel that property rights specifically are secure. That is, the profits that they earn from their ventures will not be confiscated. On the in tandem with this is low levels of corruption. So low levels of corruption reduce the cost of investment, they reduce risk, and increase productivity. Now, in contrast to this, I talked about extractive institutions earlier. So extractive institutions tend to put up barriers to entry in industries. So, for example, extractive or hindrances or barriers to entry could include expensive licenses that you have to obtain, the red tape that you have to cut through, politicians and incumbents who will stand in your way, the difficulty of getting funding from a financial sector that's often in cahoots with the incumbents' prospective enterprises that you're trying to compete against. So these barriers can sometimes be insurmountable in some countries. That's why some monopolies exist. They can keep you out of lucrative areas, or they can be your greatest friend if you are the monopolist. They can keep your competitors at bay. So oftentimes the difference between the two scenarios is whom you know, whom you can influence, and yes, whom you can bribe. So again, this is what I was talking about earlier, the difference between de jure and de facto. On paper, it might seem that there is a free market, but in reality, it depends on who you know and who you can influence. Now, political stability in general also is good for growth and development, as shown by the data, which bears out that places with increased risk of conflict tend to increase poverty, entrench poverty, and poverty likewise leads to a vicious cycle of increased conflict, leading to worsened poverty as well. So for our concepts, we can think of five broad types of economic and political institutions. The first are the market creating institutions. So these protect your property rights. These ensure that contracts are enforced. These minimize corruption and generally support the rule of law. So without these institutions, without the existence of property rights, these are the most basic institutions, there will be no markets, or the markets that do exist are likely to perform poorly. Next, we have market regulating institutions. So just because the market exists doesn't mean it works well. Sometimes you will have in economics what we call market failures, such as imperfect information. So if information is concentrated to one player in the market, we have what we call market failures. So what market regulating institutions do is they limit monopoly power. They make sure that power in the market is not consolidated, and rather that the market is oriented towards competition. But at the same time, things like public goods, like roads and fisheries and other public resources are also managed well by the government. So this is the second type of institution, market regulating institution. The third one is market stabilizing. So think of this more in terms of the macroeconomy. So your firms, your enterprises cannot function well if the macroeconomy is not doing well. So if you have high levels of inflation, for example, in Venezuela, where inflation reaches orders of magnitude on the hundreds, or Zimbabwe, for example. If you have a destabilized macroeconomy, if you have macroeconomic volatility, then you have unstable markets, and this actually discourages investment and entrepreneurship. The fourth is the market legitimizing institution. So again, this is a more macro level sort of institution. This includes things like social protection and insurance, and these focus on redistribution and managing conflict. So essentially, what these do is these protect individuals and corporations from shocks. So shocks such as a global pandemic is an important one. Disasters, which the Philippines is very familiar with in terms of typhoons, and such as adverse market outcomes, such as global financial crises. So these set up safeguards for the citizens, for the businesses, so that any economic shocks will not have long-term effects. And finally, we can talk about political institutions, which were discussed earlier. These determine how society is governed, whether society is highly democratic, whether governments encourage political participation, and generally, these are emphasized towards democratic principles. So to give you some examples of these five types of economic institutions, so market creating institutions are very important. These are the most fundamental one. We need an independent judiciary to rule on contracts, to rule on property rights. We need an effective police force to implement these rulings. And of course, we need enforceable contracts. Market regulating institutions would include regulatory agencies, for example, the Philippine Competition Commission, and other regulatory institutions. Market stabilizing institutions would include the central bank, our exchange rate system, the Department of Finance, the Department of Budget and Management, and other economic institutions. And then you have market legitimizing institutions such as pensions and social funds and political institutions. So we can think of how these institutions affect us when we talk about the flow of funds in the public sector. We have the source of funds such as our resources and our economic production. And supposedly or ideally, these go to the public. But what corruption actually does is it introduces leakages in the pipes. What ultimately these leakages do is they lower the potential resources that can be poured into the public sector, the resources that the citizen should enjoy. So how effective are the Philippines institutions? Well, we can look at the government, the World Bank's WGI indicators. We can see that there has been there was an upward trend from 2010 up to 2016, but we've seen that we've sort of stagnated in terms of improving our institutions since then. These are imperfect indicators, but they show a very tight correlation with per capita income. You can see that usually when rule of law is better, when corruption is better controlled, these countries tend to do better economically as well. But as I mentioned earlier, there is an endogenous relationship. That is, there is a virtuous cycle. If you have good institutions, you will have good economics, and if you have a good economy, you will have better institutions. So these charts sort of demonstrate that. And recently we can talk about things like the Ease of Doing Business Act, which improved our institutions, but we can also talk about lingering problems like political dynasties, the proliferation of fake news, and human rights violations as inimical towards our institutions. So as mentioned earlier, one of the sustainable development goals is to promote strong institutions. So I won't go into this anymore. But we can see that there are several issues that have popped up lately, including illicit money, which can be related to the drug trade, for example. Now, in terms of COVID-19, and as part of our work in the development process, we want to talk about it in terms of what not just what it ought to be, but what it is. We cannot just talk about the world as it should be ideally, that is free from corruption, but we have to deal with the corruption that exists. So that is, good institutions are largely normative. Okay, this is largely skewed towards liberal concepts, and to provide nuance to this analysis, um, what I want to say is that we cannot just exhaust all of our energy eliminating corruption. Of course, that is part of the process, but sometimes we have to respond to corruption dynamically. So, for example, we can look at the case of East Asia and China, where that trend of good institutions and economic growth, economic outcomes is not necessarily linear. For example, you have some countries like China, Vietnam, Thailand, where although they do not perform well in terms of voice and accountability, they do better than their relative peers when it comes to economic outcomes. So what does this mean? These countries don't promote the same democratic ideals that we generally espouse, but for some reason have been able to uh, pursue economic development. So, this introduces the concept possibly of hard versus soft governments. And I think this is why we have the rise of populism lately, because leaders like Donald Trump and President Duterte exude this sort of hardline, strongman stance that some people are willing to forego some democratic rights in favor of better economic outcomes. Of course, this leads to some tensions and contradictions. For example, in the United States, most Trump supporters are very critical of the use of masks, even though that's where the rise of COVID has taken a large turn for the worse recently. So on the practical and pragmatic approach, this is the third part of my presentation. I'm wrapping up. This is something that I would like to share in terms of the experience that we have had working in the development sector. So rather than talking about just concepts and just these idealized notions, we want to talk about what elements are we to consider pragmatically when pursuing institutional reforms. We have to talk about your binding constraints, the timeliness of reforms, the social impact, targeting, and transparency. So there are three cases, but since I'm pressed for time, I'd rather talk just about the COVID-19 response. So let's talk about the binding constraints. We know that the COVID-19 is a health issue, and the crisis that we face right now is primarily a health issue. But the constraints that we face is that this health issue will tend to affect us economically as well. Um, Longer lockdowns will lead to deeper recessions. So, of course, it is timely that we pass a stimulus measure because, as John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we are all dead. So, we need to pass these measures sooner rather than later because although the pandemic will not last forever, although the lockdowns will not last forever, the deeper the recession is, the longer it will have a lingering effect on intergenerational poverty. So in terms of social impact, we have to talk about the stimulus budget that was passed, for example, we find that it's actually lacking in terms of allocation for human health resources. There's not enough budget for nurses. That's why we have nurses who would rather prefer to leave the country. We don't have enough allocation for the Department of Health. That's why we're strapped in terms of financing procurement of the vaccine, for example. And in terms of institutions, the credibility of our institutions are also at risk, as although we're trying to implement strict wearing of masks, for example, sometimes we have government officials that would skirt on this. And then on the other hand, when our institutions are called into question, the credibility of our economic institutions at least has been quite stable, from the Department of Finance to NEDA and the Bangko Sentral. These have been at least far more reliable in terms of providing stability in terms of our institutions. However, one experience that we have had in reforms is we have to take into account the specific interests that might uh, come into play when it comes to the legislative part of the equation, that is the House of Representatives and the Senate. So some closing thoughts. I'll close again with Rizal, and here he talks about how even though the system of encomenderos had already passed during that time, he says here a term passes away, but the evil and passions engender do not pass away so long as reforms are devoted solely to changing the names. So as we take an approach to reforming our institutions, we don't think of it in terms of just who is sitting as president, which names are in power, but rather which institutions are in place. Because even if we change the names, if the institutions remain, then we don't expect to see much change. And finally, um, uh, Acemoglu and Robinson talk about how major institutional change can occur, and how these are requisites for economic change. And they talk about the concept of critical junker. So, of course, we can achieve reforms over substantial periods of time, slowly, but critical junctures are also important. These are major events that disrupt the existing political and economic balance, such as, for example, the Black Plague or the Black Death, which killed half the population in Europe, but presented opportunities to reform the political and economic institutions. And as Ram Emanuel said, a former chief of staff of the US president, he said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So, in light of COVID 19, perhaps this is an opportunity for us to review the market institutions that we have, such as our courts, our police force, for example, but also our unemployment institutions, our healthcare institutions, our central bank, our budgetary institutions, and all of these economic institutions to be more inclusive and to favor economic growth. So, with that, thank you for your time.
Thank you for that very informative presentation, Mr. Montesa, and providing a nuanced perspective. Our last speaker is Professor Edwin Santiago, a fellow and member of the editorial board of Stratbase ADR Institute. He will present a case study on corrosive capital and the threats posed by this phenomenon. Professor Santiago is a faculty member of the Political Science Department of De La Salle University since 1995. He handles courses both in the Political Science and the Development Studies program of the department. At De La Salle University, he also occupied several administrative positions, including Vice President for Administration from 2013 to 2016, Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Services from 2008 to 2013, and University Registrar from 2001 to 2013. Professor Santiago has also held positions in government. In 1998, he was head executive assistant with the rank of Assistant Secretary in the Office of the Secretary of Finance. From 1991 to 1998, he was a consultant for the Department of Budget and Management, and from 1996 to 2001, he was a consultant for the Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation. Over to you, Professor Santiago.
Thank you, Attorney Jenny. Good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon to my fellow speakers. At the outset, let me thank Stratbase ADRi for the opportunity to share the case studies that I have worked on regarding the so-called corrosive capital and the Chinese ODA in the Philippines. I'd like to thank especially Dean Domanhit, the president of ADRi. Now, on to my presentation. Also, I'd like to give a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer. My understanding and knowledge of uh, the legal concepts are working knowledge. Okay, so let me start off with the definition of the rule of law. I understand that there are many definitions, but let me work on the DOJ definition as contained in the Philippines Development Forum. So let me try to magnify this. Okay. The rule of law is a principle of governance in which all persons, institutions, and entities, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and which are consistent with international human rights norms and standards. So I've highlighted the important words there to emphasize the essence of rule of law. So rule of law includes the state. It is all about accountability, publicly promulgated laws, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated. The definition continues. It requires as well measures to ensure adherence to the principles of supremacy of law, equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law, separation of powers, participation in decision making, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. Again, I highlighted the essence of that part, which includes supremacy of law, equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness, separation of powers, participation, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and transparency. Now, the following slides, the next few slides, will give us the tone of the Chinese ODA projects from the perspective of government. Duterte said that China is an important ingredient in the Build program. The two projects that are being mentioned are the Chico River and the Kaliwa Dam project, both of which are under the Build program and the Belt and Road Initiative of China. So here, China, as if to defend China, Duterte was saying China is an important ingredient in the Build program. Next is the quote that Philippines is extra careful with China, and that is made by NEDA Secretary General Ernesto Pernia. Here is the article. The government is extra careful not to fall into the Chinese debt trap, said Socioeconomic Planning Secretary Ernesto Pernia. Given the various experiences already felt by the other countries that have already dealt with China, we are more cautious. The Director General. So, okay. So, what does this highlight? It highlights the understanding, the knowledge, and the uh, admission, if you may, of the government that China is a little too tricky to deal with. The Chinese debt trap, the government already recognizes the Chinese debt trap. Loans from Japan generally carry only 0.25 to 0.75% interest. Pernia was defending the Chinese ODA loans by saying that the government needs more friends like China to carry out ambitious infrastructure projects. I will go into more details later. Also, insofar as the Kaliwa Dam, this is the pronouncement of the president. President Duterte said he would use all the powers of the presidency to bring an end to water shortage in Manila, even if the solution may pose environmental damage. Take note, even if the solution may pose environmental damage. He said that the environmental violations is not enough of a reason to delay a project that could provide a new source of water. Just because your environment will be spoiled, that will not be a good answer. Okay, now the background of these two projects. Chico River is officially known as the Chico River Pump Irrigation Project. The purpose of this is to provide ample and stable water supply to 8,700 hectares of agricultural land through diversion and canal systems. It's also meant to increase productivity and benefit some 4,300 farmers, 4,300 farmers in 21 barangays. The Kaliwa Dam project, officially known as the New Centennial Water Source Kaliwa Dam project, on the other hand, will supply some 600 million liters of water per day and benefit some 17.5 million people, or about 3.5 million households in Metro Manila and neighboring provinces of Rizal and Quezon. It's supposed to reduce the current 97% dependence on the Angat Dam. Now, I've made a table comparing these two projects. Uh, you will notice that these two projects are almost identical, uh, except for some tweaks. So, number one, in these projects, these two projects both belong to the Build It program. They both belong to the Belt and Road Initiative of China. For the Chico River, the source of funding is an ODA from the Export Import Bank of China, which, as you may know, is owned by the state. This is a shift. Previously, this was supposed to be funded from the General Appropriations Act, but when Duterte came in, this was changed to become ODA from China. The Kaliwa Dam, on the other hand, uh, is supposed to be funded under a public-private partnership, but it was shifted to an ODA also with the Export-Import Bank of China. Insofar as the environmental concerns, both of these projects carry serious concerns about environmental degradation, widespread flooding, disturbing the biodiversity in the area. For the Kaliwa Dam, the concerns are more serious because it involves earthquake since you're building a dam. The other issue, insofar as the environment is concerned, is the issuance of the environmental compliance certificate. This was considered premature. In fact, when DNR issued this, it was conditional, and a conditional environmental compliance certificate that was seen only as a way for the project to proceed. The conditions that have been imposed by the ECC are the same conditions that that are required for the ECC to be approved. So if you can imagine how much this is such a ploy just to make the project proceed. There are also sociocultural issues like the faulty consultation with the IPs. There was the failure of the issuance of the free, prior, and informed consent, which is needed under our laws regarding the indigenous people. The selection of the contractor was equally violative of certain rule of law principles. The contractor for the Chaco River is the China CAMC Engineering, which is also state-owned. There was no transparency in the selection involved. In the selection, it's involved in an anomalous project. The contractor was previously uh, flagged for being involved in an anomalous project. The government said that we will not engage with contractors with uh, dubious past, and yet that company was selected for the Chico River. If you do a search on the process that was made for this project, you will not find um, too many information. So there is very serious lack of transparency in the selection of this contractor. For the Kaliwa Dam, they tried to remedy some of the transparency issues, except that there were audit findings for the Kaliwa Dam. COA said that the selection of the contractor was equivalent to a negotiated contract from the inception of the bidding process. Since there were three bidders, two were disqualified, uh, making China Energy Engineering Corporation the only qualified bidder. Interest rate, the Chinese loans had higher interest rates than the other ODAs. According to the Philippine government, through NEDA, though they are higher than other ODAs, they are still lower than commercial rates. I will show you later uh, the rates. Okay, so these are the rates. It's 2% per annum for 20 years for both the Chico River and the Kaliwa Dam. For ODA, for projects under ODA with South Korea, it's 0.14, 0.15. From Japan, these are the rates. So obviously, the rates used for the Chinese ODA are grossly higher and disadvantageous to the government. And as I said, the defense of government is that these are still lower rates than commercial uh, banks would provide. Okay, the other issue is on the issue of sovereign immunity. Section 3, Article 16 of the Constitution says the state may not be sued without its consent. Comparing that with the loan agreement, Article 8.1 of the Chico River agreement says the borrower hereby irrevocably waives any immunity on the grounds of sovereign or otherwise for itself or its property in connection with any arbitration proceeding. Uh, in layman's terms, uh, the implication of this is that we cannot claim that we are a sovereign and we cannot say that we are immune from lawsuit. So that also means that in the event that we default and the lender, which is China, decides to take away or control some of our properties, then by this provision, uh, they can do that, similar to the experience of the Chinese death trap in other countries. Okay. Similarly, Article 5.7 of the Kaliwadam Agreement says neither the borrower is entitled to any right of immunity. We just change the words, but it essentially means the same. As to confidentiality, Article 12 of the Philippine Constitution says foreign loans may only be incurred in accordance with law and the regulation of the monetary authority. Information on foreign loans obtained or guaranteed by the government shall be made available to the public. Now, the loan agreement says, both loan agreements will say this: the borrower shall keep all the terms, conditions, and standard of fees strictly confidential. Okay. As to the arbitration, the arbitration will be done before SITAC for the Chico River and will be before the Hong Kong Arbitration Center for the Kaliwada. Section 20, Article 7 of the Constitution says the President may contract or guarantee foreign loans on behalf of the Republic of the Philippines with prior concurrence of the Monetary Board and subject to such limitations as may be provided by law. Now, the CRPIP loan agreement was signed on April 10 but was approved by the Monetary Board on May 17. So clearly, this was not prior concurrence of the Monetary Board. Now, what has been the response of the government to all of these issues? Spokesman Salvador Panelo says the loan agreements have been vetted and above board. The controversial provisions are standard for Chinese contracts. The provision on waiver of immunity is irrelevant as the Philippines is a responsible borrower and will not default on its payments. You can obviously see how these responses do not actually answer the issues. Loan agreements have been vetted and above board is more of a claim, a statement, rather than something that can be that has been documented and has made transparent. There is nothing that will clearly show that they have been vetted and are above board. Uh, Nothing convincing. The controversial provisions are standard for Chinese contracts. Does not mean that while they may be standard, that does not mean that the Philippine government should agree to them. And third, the provision of waiver of immunity is irrelevant because we are a responsible borrower. It does not deny the issue that this is an onerous provision. It just says that it will not happen because we are a responsible borrower. So that is actually sidestepping the issue. So what are the conclusions for from these two case studies? The loans from China for the two projects are obviously disadvantageous to the Philippines based on the interest rates and the other loan terms. Second, the agreement signed with China the agreements signed with China contain provisions inconsistent with the laws of the Philippines, as we have seen. Uh, Third, despite audit reports and other serious allegations against the Chinese funded infrastructure projects, the wheels of accountability do not seem to have been put into motion. There are several issues, except that nobody has been investigated. There is no process that has been started to look into this. There is severe lack of transparency about the agreements from the very start. Leverage China leveraged the special friendship extended by the Philippine government. If you think about it, we did not have to take on those Chinese loans. At that time, Philippines was enjoying a very good credit rating in the international capital market, and there were several offers, even better, much better offers from South Korea and Japan. So for us, for the Philippine government to actually make it look like we are a beggar who cannot choose is really misleading. So obviously, the tenets of rule of law were disregarded in the case of procedural and legal transparency, in terms of participation in decision making, obviously in the avoidance of arbitrariness. In the Chico River, the contractor was practically pre-selected. So there was it was not independently. There is no provision for independent adjudication, as was demonstrated. If there are disputes, we will have to go before SITAC and the other one in Hong Kong, which are clearly controlled by China. And the supremacy of law was really not observed, and even the accountability. The adherence to the rule of law has been compromised in these two Chinese funded infrastructure projects, and the funds for these projects may be described and termed as corrosive investments, as coined by CITE, or the Center for International Private Enterprise. This come from authoritarian regimes and undermine democratic processes and institutions in the receiving countries. These investments can actively exploit and amplify governance gaps, undermine democratic institutions, and make countries more susceptible to political and economic manipulation. I'm sure you will agree with me that this is exactly what has happened in the case of these two Chinese ODA projects. Without strong accountability, transparency, and oversight mechanisms, the adverse impacts of such sharp power can go unnoticed and challenged. So thank you very much. So for sorry for the rush, but I have to watch out for the time. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful case studies on the adverse human rights impact of corrosive capital, Professor Santiago. You rightly highlighted the lack of accountability and transparency surrounding some of these arrangements. Thank you to all our panelists for today. I'll open the floor now to questions from the audience. And during this open forum, you can also share your comments to any of the points made during the panel. I believe we have one question from an anonymous attendee, uh, addressed to nobody in particular, but I think maybe Professor Pangalangan can answer this question. What basic rights of the people need to be focused in this time of crisis? Anybody from the panel would like to answer that question?
Please repeat. Please repeat the
What
question.
basic
What
Yes, Judge. What basic rights of the people need to be focused in this time of crisis of COVID-19?
I believe it should be focused on the economic needs of the people, economic and health needs of the people. While the law, the passage of the SAP law are focused on the rights of the people on cash assistance, which is both economic and health in purpose, they were not given to the correct or rightful recipients who were intended to be covered by the SAP law. As of now, there are so many sectors that are complaining that they have not received the assistance that were supposedly given to them. That is the answer that I can make.
Jen, yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I was speaking, but I didn't know that I was on mute. So thank
Oh,
you, Jen Ali, for answering the question.
uh, maybe Professor Pangalangan, you can start.
Ah, you said what's the question again? What needs of the people? Okay,
Yes.
should be given priority. Well, in my presentation, I gave two sets of rights. Now, the civil political rights on one hand, which are called the first generation rights. I'm sorry that this will sound like an academic discussion, but the ECOSOC rights, economic, social, cultural rights, which are the second generation rights. Although both are important, both are equally important, and our government has signed up to respect, protect, and fulfill both sets of rights. So, in a public health crisis like what we have now, of course, we have to look at the immediate needs of the people, the need to, well, for tests, the need for cure. That is why we have the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act, which sidesteps many of the what do you call the safeguards, no, to ensure that there is transparency. Again, to be able to deal right away with the urgent needs of the people. But although that is important and that has to be addressed, a public emergency does not justify the violation of human rights. So, because there are in the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, there are rights that are non-derogable, meaning to say that no matter how bad it is, no matter what the emergency is, then the right to expression, the freedom from servitude, right to life, cannot be derogated on. This cannot be suspended. No, so I would say that there is an immediate need to address the right to health of individuals, but this should not call for sacrificing the other rights that I mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And a lot of human rights groups have rightly raised their concern about how some of the civil and political rights are undermined during this pandemic, using the COVID-19 as a pretext. The next question comes from Mr. Emmanuel Kaliwan. In your honest assessment, is there a problem with our laws or on our anti-corruption laws, or is it the implementation and the culture that is the problem? So anybody who would like to answer? Judge.
Yes, it has been my position from the very beginning that we have all kinds of laws penalizing or defining corruption, yet the implementation is very, very uh, unsatisfactory. And this is, again, giving more time for the corrupt people to do their business because the laws do not really uh, put a hard solution to the crimes that they have committed. If they are caught, then it takes time for the courts to resolve the case. And there is no one that has been convicted for plunder, not that I know of. So this becomes an encouragement for the people to keep on robbing the public of the financial resources of the government. So it because of the delay in the prosecution, in the resolution of the cases, then they continue with their trade, and that is the problem that we have. We have all the laws, but the implementation is really very, very frustrating. So it is the implementation that is the problem that we have. Because as I have stated in my paper, that the prosecution has even resorted to delaying the outcome of the prosecution or the investigation because it takes some form of a money generating machine for them to sit on the cases and just wait for the complainant to tire. And then when the complainant is tired and frustrated and they desist from continuing their complaints, then that's it. The culprit becomes scot-free. There was a time when I was informed that for the Department of Justice just to review petitions for review filed by complainants, there were already 15,000 pending for just a period of 1 year in that department. And how will this be resolved by the courts if in that stage it is still taking so much time for the Department of Justice as the prosecution arm of the government to file the cases with the courts? So if the prosecution is tarrying in resolving cases, then it goes to show that the wheels of justice is not really functioning well.
Thank you very much for that, Judge Espanol. Any of the other panelists who'd like to answer that question on whether there's a lack of anti-corruption laws, or if there is an implementation problem or a problem of culture in fighting corruption in the Philippines?
Can I share my thoughts on this?
Yes, Mr. Montesa. Yes.
So I'd like to first refute the notion that it's a cultural problem. I think even way back then there was this notion that there's a cultural problem with Filipinos. That's why Rizal wrote The Indolence of the Filipino, because there was this notion that Filipinos are lazy or tamad, or even now there's this notion of kaya malala yung problema ng COVID, for example, is kasi pasaway yung mga Pilipino. Or for the non-Tagalog speakers, there's a cultural problem. Filipinos are unable inherently to follow the rules. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Um, there was a study done using Google Map data, and they found that Filipinos actually did follow regulations on restrictions on travel, for example. So Google is able to track your location data, and they found that the data shows that Filipinos did not violate quarantine protocols. So the data shows that Filipinos are not necessarily bad or inherently my inherent cultural problem. And I don't think it's also right to say that there's inherent corruption in the system. Rather, I think what um, Judge Espanyol elaborated on is there might be unspoken or unwritten rules that we might be following. So, for example, although, again, I'm not a legal expert, although the laws provide for a specific timeline for cases to be resolved, there might be an unspoken rule of there's a war of attrition between people who file cases and people who are on the other end. So, they know that there's an incentive to just wait it out if you have more resources, if you have more money, right? So it goes back to what I talked about earlier. What are the formal and informal institutions? There are myriads of formal institutions of laws and regulations tackling anti-corruption, but what are the informal, unwritten rules that are in place that give incentives to people? And that's what it's all about. A policeman is not inherently corrupt necessarily, but would respond to what incentives are there. If his pay is too low, he will look for other sources of income. If a judge is not properly compensated, then they will look for other sources of income. In economics, we call that economic rents, for example, that they might derive other benefits from positions of power rather than the monetary compensation that's provided to them by law. So we have to also look at those other informal institutions, and they can even be codified formally to become laws and regulations.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Montesa. Um, I have another question here uh, to any of the panelists who'd like to answer. What is the role of the private sector in combating corruption? And I think this ties in with the whole of society response that Strat-based ADR Institute has been pushing for, even during the Pilipinas conference a few weeks ago. And relatedly, what can corporate regulators like the SEC do to help address corruption and human rights abuses? Anybody would like to answer that question? Two questions, actually. The role of the private sector in combating corruption, and the role of corporate regulators like the SEC to help address corruption and human rights abuses by companies.
Yeah. I I will try answering those questions. It is my observation because I've been involved in non-governmental organizations fighting corruption for the last 26 years now. And it is my view that when there is an organization that is addressing corruption, the problem of corruption, there are people who are affected, who are pulling them down in order that the corruption issues will not be able to get the public's attention. So this is the problem that we have, that whenever there is one that is specializing on a problem, there are critics who are trying to pull them down so that their the problem will not be able to get an enormous amount of publicity, and they will be able to go into their practices more unimpeded. So for the non-governmental organizations to succeed, I think there should be a unity of purpose. Hindi tayo mag-kanya-kanya lang. We have to have a bandwagon of all advocacies that is related to fighting corruption. Let us not do it just for the purpose of getting media mileage. Let us do it for a more serious and honest, to goodness sentiment, so that the problem that we are facing will be resolved, in order that the problem will not keep on growing and growing until we tire and then we just fade away. To me, let us work together and pool our resources together so that we will be able to achieve some sort of solution to the problem. Thank you.
AI.
Yes, Professor Santiago.
Okay, I think the role of the private sector is one of vigilance and participation. We know that good governance requires participation from the people, because that is where we are able to materialize accountability. Private sector, the civil society should demand uh, the accountability from the government. Voting for the so-called right people will only get us so far. There is no guarantee that the people we vote for are the people who will lead us to better governance. But the more important part there is the continued vigilance that the private sector, the people can do, and the participation and the demand for accountability, so that government will not feel that they are free, absolutely free to do whatever they want.
Thank you for that. Anybody from the panel or
I would like to add that even among government agencies, kanya-kanya ang pasikat ng mga those who are given the power and authority to conduct investigation or to address the problem. They would want that their agency will be the top-notch agency to solve the problem. So instead of working together and assisting one another, sharing what they know of the problem, or that the evidence that they have about the problem, they fight against each other, and therefore they do not achieve the purpose for which they were created. That is the hardest problem that we have. For instance, di ba, there has been so many instances wherein the policemen and the military people are fighting each other. That should not be the case. We should have the public interest upper hand of anything that we are assigned to do. So if we can resolve this problem, I think we can expect a better atmosphere of peace and quiet in our country.
Jen, may I just add a bit because it was already said, but I'd like to reiterate that again, we're talking about human rights. So we are the rights holders. These are rights we have as human beings, so we claim them. So, as part of the private sector, it is our responsibility to exercise those rights and demand that government respects them. So, if we let government do whatever it wants to do, then we are remiss also in protecting and exercising our own rights. So, the private sector as a group Of course, we help government, the businesses should work together with government, but at the same time, um, demand that government also comply with what we often see as the higher standard in the private sector. So we say that, oh, they're more efficient because they have more strictly follow rules. So we demand the same level of commitment from government. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think we're almost it's already 2:30 from where I am, and I believe it's 4 o'clock in Manila. So with that, to close today's virtual town hall discussion, I will turn it over to Mr. Paco Pangalangan, the Executive Director of the Strat-based ADR Institute and lead convener of Democracy Watch Philippines.
All right. Hi. First of all, thank you, Jen, Domino, for moderating another informative virtual town hall discussion. Also, thank you to our speakers, Judge Dali Espanol, of course, my favorite speaker of the day, Professor Beth Aguilin Pangalangan, Professor Edwin Santiago, and AER's AJ Montesa. As mentioned earlier, this week, the United Nations observes two international days. The first is the International Anti-Corruption Day. Corruption, of course, affects all countries. It undermines the democratic institutions and contributes to governmental instability by warping the rule of law, attacking election integrity, and creating bureaucratic loopholes that facilitate dishonest behavior by those in positions of power. Corruption also slows economic development by wasting public funds, bogging down business operations, and scaring away investors. In the Philippines, in 2018, the World Financial Review said the Philippines had lost almost 10 billion US dollars every year to illicit financial flows. In 2019, citing UN estimates, the Deputy Ombudsman, Cyril Ramos, noted that corruption loss in the country was estimated at 20% of annual government appropriations. This meant that at the time, the Philippine government could have lost around 1.4 trillion pesos to corruption since 2017. The second UN International Day observed this week is the International Human Rights Day. The day commemorates the UN General Assembly's adoption of the Universal Health Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees every individual a broad range of fundamental rights and freedoms, regardless of their nationality, place of residence, gender, national or ethnic origin, religion, language, or any other status. According to a 2020 UN report on human rights in the Philippines, and I quote, "While there have been important human rights gains in recent years, particularly in economic and social rights, the underpinning focus on national security threats, real and inflated, has led to serious human rights violations reinforced by harmful rhetoric from high-level officials." These figures tell us that the issues of corruption and human rights violations are long-standing issues that have plagued the country for years. But this year especially, it forces us to view these persistent issues from the additional lens of the COVID-19 pandemic. Here in the Philippines, the government's response to COVID-19 has been characterized by the unchecked movement of large discretionary funds, creating opportunities for corrupt practices by opportunistic public servants. This creates a multifaceted threat by interacting with the rising trend of human rights and persistent impunity. As we observed this week, the International Anti-Corruption Day and International Human Rights Day, we should keep in mind how COVID-19 has only exacerbated the challenges that the country faces on these fronts. We at Strat-based ADR Institute and Democracy Watch Philippines believe that all sectors of society, from civil society, academe, the government, and the private sector, all have a role to play in combating corruption and human rights violations. And while we remember these challenges during this week, we must keep in mind that the pandemic has created even more opportunity for corruption. Winston Churchill said, "An optimist sees an opportunity in every calamity. A pessimist sees a calamity in every opportunity." So while this COVID-19 has created opportunities for corruption of pandemic proportions, we have an opportunity to come together to hold this government accountable for the consequences of what it does and does not do during this COVID-19 health crisis. Again, on behalf of Strat-Based ADR Institute, our president, Dean Dumanhit, and our partners, TI Philippines, UPIHR, and Democracy Watch Philippines, a big thank you to all those that participated today, and to all have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Bye. Beth, thank you.